Let's do it.
Yeah. Do you
Data
want to go?
democracy, scaled down to an organization. Does it work? Does it not work? How do they benefit?
So my first thinking around data democratization, and I haven't read enough to,
Well, Philippe, you're a little bit echoey. I'm not sure why. At
right,
least
better now?
no.
Yeah, let me fix that.
Okay,
Let's switch microphone. Let's see what,
that's better.
closer to the microphone. Let's see if this
Okay,
works better. Better sound?
better.
Yeah. All right. So when I'm thinking of democratization and not having really been part of the public conversation enough on LinkedIn, so I would just preamble by that. But I'm thinking that a lot of the things that Chad Saunderson, if I get that name right, is talking about is how the data efforts and the typed correct data and data contract efforts in companies are really remnants of an era where we worked hard on getting the data right because the cost of not doing so was very, very high. And then we ran so much of that data that we failed to build new foundations for where we stand at the moment. So we really ran out of that the initial big ideas, the initial very type data that we could do something with. And so what happens then, and I connect that to data democratization, is that if we do data democratization without thinking about the governance around that data, so all of the governance structures that we need to have around our data democratization, we will just have a lot of people running with the data that is good, but it will be less and less of it over time. So we can run around and do all sorts of things with the data that is there, but we need to ensure that we also get the good data running. And we've been talking about good data for a long time in this group. So, but I think that it's an important part of data democratization. Enabling people to do a lot of things needs necessary foundations to enable that work. The governance, the platforms, the ways of working, the thinking, the architecture, etc. So those are some of the things that immediately come to mind when thinking about that term. It's easy to say, but a lot harder to do because you need to build the basic foundations. You need to build the constitution of how that will work, and that we're agreeing together that we're in a wider ecosystem and a constellation of a lot of moving parts that need to be working together in some kind of governed space. That would be the thing
Yeah.
I throw in there.
So the hard parts are the same as a democracy in general, right? The hard parts are consensus.
Yes,
And you,
because we a lot of where we come from, we need to ensure that those foundations exist in order for, and we're seeing how democratic movements in general have been weakened over and over as we try to maximize our profits out of that system. And we're not building the foundations so that it's a sustainable system.
I, if I could interject, it's a very stimulating topic. Ironically, I worked for years trying to make data available through the federal government, and often I thought data democracy was more aspirational than it was real, largely because there's an asymmetry to information, and people make money off of their data. And so everyone wants your data, but nobody wants to give you their data. It's
Yeah.
been a massive problem for years. And the other thought that I had is, I thought, through my arc, through my career, I started out on mainframes, obviously. And I started out with cards on mainframes. And what I found is there was a whole lot of innovation from an economic standpoint when the barriers to entry to computers were reduced. When people could get on PCs and have their own computers, they could develop open source software. It was no longer just five guys that could get to a mainframe that cost $10 million, that could write assembler. And all of a sudden you could waste time on computers, and the inventiveness seemed to really increase right around 84, 85, when people really started getting their own computers to do whatever they wanted with. And so I suspect the same thing is with data. we can't get to data. Even now, when you think about what's happening with Microsoft and the LLMs, the GPTs, is all that data is becoming, even though it's your data and my data, it's becoming proprietary very quickly to Microsoft and to GPT. It's becoming proprietary. And so all of our data is now becoming proprietary, and it's not being shared. Even the Twitter stuff now, even though they didn't create the content, they own it now, which is interesting. And they're not sharing that because of the value in that. So two thoughts. Asymmetry of information is power. And so there's incentive to not share your data and not make it democratic. And the second thing is, by making it democratic, by lowering the entries to barrier, you create innovation and increase productivity. I don't know how you create the incentives to make that happen. And then the second piece of it is governance, to me, is a moving target. Because if I do anything with data, more and more it's the context. Particularly the most powerful data is creating a data fabric, when you're linking everything together, all the different versions of reality, or all different perspectives. When I link IRS data and veterans data together, all of a sudden I get to see where people work, a little bit about their lifestyle, and I also see their medical situation. So linking to data creates more power, and you get to choose more things. So it becomes a moving target. And so governance has to evolve toward accuracy. And there has to be incentives for all the players to, they have to get something in return to constantly want to make their data more powerful. So it's a very interesting problem for me.
Yeah. Then how do we govern that space? It's not just about setting up a governance forum and having the right people. So who are the right people in this effort in general? How do we bring that collective value of the linked vast ecosystem of things that we have?
Well,
we don't know the future anymore, in a way.
I was involved with a process where everyone in the government and with the government data project, after FedStats, it was data.gov. And somebody came in and said, we want to put Sparkle engines up everywhere, and we're going to put everything in RDF. And they said, if you have it in RDF, you don't have to know anything to know the data. It just answers itself. And I'm always skeptical of magic pills. But what they started doing is they started linking the same ASCII words together. And in a case that I always use is income, because the federal government asks lots of questions and they ask your income. They only ask two surveys where they want to get your official income, and that is the unemployment statistics and something that is long form decennial data. But all the health statistics ask your data. All the housing surveys ask your data. Everything out there asks your income, rather. And the difference is the income means different things in different surveys. And just because you link the two words together doesn't mean they're equivalent. And so what you end up with, everyone says we should get a committee of really smart people together and they should define everything. Well, they tried that probably for 30 years and they were never able to get it together. Because for one thing, you're always collecting new data and it's a moving target. So they want to create a brittle structure, almost like they did with SNOMED at NIH when they came up with medical terms. I don't know if you're familiar with that. But you find different segments of the medical community use the same terminology to mean different things. So they have problems with SNOMED, and it's probably the most expensive ontology the government's ever produced. So the question is, how do you get people who contribute the data, and how do you create a baseline which ends up being a plumb line to say, this is what this means, or this is closest to this. because every data element is going to be slightly different from every other data, depending on how it was collected, its geography, the time, what's related to. How do you create plumb lines? And then how do you create incentives for people to move it toward that plumb line and then allow you to differentiate it? And how do you, or even say it's exactly the same? For example, in geography measurements, it can be a real pain to get geography together. And then how do you, the other thing is in nature, it seems in neural networks, things tend to vote. How can you create a voting mechanism that tends to move toward a graceful solution of governance? I've said it. Sorry.
Yeah. I'm wondering if we could step back a bit, because I think the question, as I understood it from Andrew, is, what are the organizational structures that lend themselves to democracy? And I think the points made here are really familiar, but I'm sort of thinking in terms of advanced organizations and organizations that might be more porous in terms of their boundaries. They're working with each other more, maybe in a supply chain context or something like that. And so if the question is, where does democracy, where is it promising, where can it actually be implemented? Then maybe we start with the organizational types that have these more porous boundaries, and they're used to collaborating externally more. And I'm not saying government's not that, but there's got to be certain kinds of organizational structures in government that lend themselves to that kind of thing, don't they? I mean, these public organizations have a public mandate, but it just seems like the structures that have been created that, I'm sorry, Caps, what's your first name?
Cavan, I'm sorry.
Cavan.
Right.
Yeah, I think I've been in government too, and it's been frustrating. At the same time, in intelligence anyway, you've got this mandate to share pretty broadly. And the thing was that the systems that we were using were antiquated. But I think that there's a potential there because of the motivation. Everybody understands there's a sharing problem, and so it's sort of like, where do we start with this data democracy? Is that the question, Andrew?
Yeah, it is. Like at the organizational level, what does it look like? I think the original author and the guy who wrote the post kind of answered his own question, in my opinion, in another post. He said that, one of the problems with a lot of these people in the data community is that they want to give the nitty-gritty details as to what a data democracy looks like. And they want to tell the business stakeholders, this is what it looks like, this is what we need to do. And they largely don't care. They don't even care about like they want to know, in effect, if the sausage tastes different, not how it's made and what the factory is like. And so that's almost, he likened that to democracy in general, especially in the United States, because many people say in the US, they haven't memorized the Constitution. They don't understand or know the benefits that have been given to them. They largely benefit from those. And that rings true. Like, so I guess the question is, how do you get organizations to understand, or not understand, but benefit from a democratic data environment where they don't have to think about it too much, I guess. But there also has to be those who are well versed in the democracy and kind of are the shoulders that carry the weight of keeping the democracy intact. Something like that. That exists in democracy today, and it's actually, as we can see in today's world, it's can be fragile. It can break on a moment's notice. But so how do you do that in a data context? in knowledge context, really.
One thing that forgive me for interrupting again, but one of the things that I had experience with is I set up a large network, and I found that basically I basically set it up as an experiment without any standards, because I had done it with standards before and I had gotten really kind of run over. I did the standard thing that you do in government. We have a standards committee and you have everybody, what I found is that people in the room really didn't have the expertise to set the standards on the new software coming in. And I found that that the people who came to the committee had time to come to the committee. So the people who were really running the show never showed up. And so their needs were never discussed. And I was working for the Army at the time. And so the people whose needs really needed stuff, they'd go to the general and over, basically throw out our decisions and do whatever they wanted. I couldn't manage it. So I went to another agency and I said, no standards. And what I found was I just said, make sure that I can install it gracefully and I can manage it. So what I actually did is I said, if you want a new piece of software and it conflicts with this other software, you've got to be the chairman of figuring out how you want it installed, and I'll install it and manage it for you off the network. But I'm not going to argue, between these different standards of graphics. I'm sorry about that phone. But what I found is that people started to standardize on their own because they need to pass documents back and forth. And so when I walked away from that, I said standardization often happens when people need to communicate. So for example, if you build a house in the United States, as long as it works with 110 current, you can make it a clock or a fluorescent light or an ironing board or a washing machine or whatever, but it's all got to plug into this grid. It's got to communicate on that grid if their incentives are that they want to communicate. So they started standardizing themselves. The irony was I was in an agency and they had an IG come through, and my superior was flipping out because he says, you have the most unstandardized, you don't have any standards. How are we going to survive this standards audit? It turned out that I had the most standard environment of the entire agency. People had standardized themselves. What I found was I couldn't understand why it worked. And so I went around asking people. I talked to this friend of mine who's a physicist, and I said, are you really into Linux? And she says, no, I use an Apple. And I said, why you do computationally intensive stuff? How come you're not into Linux? She says, I can't keep up with the physics literature, let alone the computer science literature.
Yeah.
And so it kind of came to, there's a distribution, at least in this situation, where most people were really thinking about something else. So the main part of the bell curve, they didn't care. As long as it solved their problem, they used it. There's 10, 15% that no matter what standards you come up with, your solutions won't work. And so they'll invent their own. So my goal was to make them graceful. I made them work for me rather than pulling against me. So they would submit their, I'd publicize what they come up with and said, if you need to understand this, go talk to Charlie Brown over there, and he'll set you up. Because frankly, I don't care. I don't want to deal with it. And so what happened is it was like a ecosystem. It standardized itself. But it was because the incentives turned out to be right. And it was something, it was an accident, but I've always, self-assembly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that is a really good point. And when I was at PwC, I basically realized after years of fighting with the formal organization that I really had to work informally and just get the passionate people who wanted to solve the problem in the same room with each other and try to make some progress that way. So it's sort of like the formal organizations are not set up to lend themselves to this sort of self-assembly.
I'm thinking here, there's something that bubbles in my mind relating to data democratization. Is it an end goal, or is it something that you strive towards? So, Kevin, I in a way continue on where you were. So my thinking goes along the lines that, well, maybe it's an outcome, much like agile is an outcome of good managerial processes, in my view, at least. I'm following the small a agile movement. I don't believe in Scrum and other things. I think those are an end state. When you're doing it well, you probably have something working, but it's not the process you should be using. You need to learn those processes by learning how to get there. I think the democratization might be actually the same thing. You cannot drive in that direction. It's like trying to get to happiness. It will not get you there. You need to do things so that you get happy. So it's kind of maybe an outcome that might have some prerequisites to them that enables you to have that end state. And so what are those prerequisites? So that's a different way of thinking about it. So what are the things that bring that end state? Back to Alan, thank you for backstepping a few steps to get us thinking on a higher order.
Yeah.
So wonder if there's a way to, almost like you talk about game theory, it's all penalties, incentives. Can you, my goal was always to keep things graceful, because we did with 2 people what 10 people had done before. So part of it was delegating, and part of the delegation is a bad idea here, but instead of pushing the mules, I wanted the mules to pull, so to speak. And so part of it was, how do you build, and it was an accident, I didn't do it, but how do you build an incentive system where people are better off by, evolving this behavior? At that point, it becomes a process, not a end state. Because what I had at the end of that was fascinating. I always had software that was coming in that was growing, and I always had software that was dying. So I had this constant, evolution of things going in and out gracefully. And I had like 5% of people they're just creative and they just wanted to do something different. Oftentimes their stuff wouldn't grow. The voting public of people by use wouldn't use their software, so it would die. So if there's a way to build, it's intriguing to me. I look at, if I get into ant decision making, where they vote. One ant does a random walk, he finds some food and he puts a scent trail back, and then you have another ant that comes across the scent trail and they put another. And so, the queen makes no decision. She's the most inept one of the whole group, right? But there's no lieutenants, no captains, no generals, but they make these phenomenal decisions, and they're all done by effective voting. So there's a collective intelligence happening there.
Yeah.
So if you can make the collective intelligence graceful and evolutionary, that's what the market does. That's what ecology does theoretically. It's just my
Yeah, Kevin, those are good points, because maybe if ultimately, large scope, if you want to kind of engender an outcome, people need to have the same goals. I mean, everybody needs to be on board. You have to have incentives. Maybe it's not democracy so much as an example of evolution. You're giving analogies. Maybe it's not an analogy, but it's actually what it is. Maybe it's an evolutionary thing.
And the thing is, at least in my opinion, the pruning and the promotion in evolution is a form of voting. The things that,
right.
Yeah, on my side, I didn't read the post. I don't know the book, but Data Democracy, what it's inspiring for me, it's like data network effects. And I think your collective intelligence is also a similar thing. It's that the more data you have, the more impact you could bring. and also there is another aspect in my understanding, is that it's to make data-driven, data-enlightened decisions. This I would feel like democracy, like me. On contrary to, I don't know, some kind of selfishness or intuition-based decisions. Okay, so this for me is what called to data democracy. But I have a problem, and you mentioned this also in the discussion today. I don't see how data can vote. Okay, I don't see data. Okay, but if you have data democracy compliant people and the right and good data, then the people can maybe make the right vote thanks to data. But yeah, I can't imagine how data could vote. Okay, and the way I can imagine this, maybe, okay, if you're just trying to do the math, okay, run the math, and then, okay, so the data is this, so we have to do this, and maybe you code this, then it's not democracy. Okay, it's like the anti-democracy. It's like the algorithm, the basic and maybe wrong algorithm, is governing.
There's something about. I'll bring up a use case, because on the back of that one, I think that I connect back to our certified public accountant that was here and talked. I just forgot his name right now. Charles? No? Yeah. Anyhow, so I was thinking of you have data that is in a bad shape. What happens in general, and I'm thinking data democratization will have more of this, the copying around, so the data is all over the place. So what I want to bring up there is that if we would be enabling the mechanisms for data becoming better, that means that everyone will have a lot of value out of it, and they will use the best data for whatever they're doing. So if we find the ability, and then maybe it's the technical me that is thinking, but if we would be able to have the transformation of data being core, that we actually work to improve the data. The mechanisms are there to take the base data and then apply transformations to them. I was working with the Zero Trust strategy of the Department of Defense. They are publishing all of their ways of working with the capabilities and the activities to achieve Zero Trust as part of PDFs. First off, PDF is not a good way to transport data in tabular format, but you can use Excel to bring them out. Next problem is that people have not encoded these correctly. So the data is done by hand. So you have a major amount of data issues. But if you want data democratization across society, across organization, they want to do Zero Trust the same way so that they can build upon each other's stuff. It would need to be organized. And instead of having a data source in a PDF, we should perhaps have it in a more tabular form or in RDF or something else. But we also need the mechanism to transform that data into a better shape. So I only do the delta between A and B. And then B is better, but it's based on the original source. And I can see exactly how those transformations happen. Then someone else can take the next step and the next step and build upon it. That way, we have a mechanism for data democratization that would help us become better and better at data and go from content to data as well. But I don't know, I'm being very technocratic, but it's one of the things that just popped in a way of thinking around this, because the mechanisms probably are needed in order to do a lot of work in a better way, enabling one another in a wider ecosystem of data.
I see what you're saying. I think that in my mind, what I heard Olivier say, that is related to what he said, in that you mentioned data networks. When we think about data, we often think about its embodiment in a database, and words mean things. And because we think of data as it is coming from like this one place that you can point at, honestly, I think that's part of the problem. We can't go to where we want to go when we think that way. If data was thought of more as a network, and you create kind of islands of knowledge is nodes, then you can start doing the things you're talking about, which is like, just automatic lineage to different sources, and you start to use inference to do transformations and all those things. But when we start thinking about collecting data and we want to put it in one place, everybody's doing the same thing, then when we want to expand out and expand the knowledge that's collectively out there in the world, it becomes a more difficult proposition. It's almost as if, going back to the evolution biology thing, if all the organs in the body decided to have, their own set of rules, and they weren't subsystems, and that's how we embody data now. Organs that think that they're the whole organism, and that's, at least in my mind, the problem. And I see that being echoed from each and every one of you, and everything that you're saying. That's kind of a problem.
Yeah, and I think, Andrew, building on that, you've been in our little knowledge graph working group that's trying to become a think tank, and we've got people on both sides of the spectrum. We've got well, for example, we've got the formalists, and Cavan, there was a good case study at the last data-centric architecture forum where DHS presented, the Customs and Border Patrol folks, and very familiar problem that they had with architecture that just didn't lend itself to bringing data together to solve problems. And the same struggles you just mentioned, they also mentioned. So now they've embarked on this ontological approach to bringing all the data together, and they're using basic formal ontology, BFO, to do that. And I think it's a very inspired group that's trying to do this, but you wonder, okay, where are the obstacles that they're going to encounter, and how are they going to get around them? So at the other side of the spectrum in our working group, we've got the people who are informal by comparison. They're not using formal ontologies. They don't believe that that's the right starting point. And people like Jury Lagos, for example, he just wants the connections to be out there. And basically, he's trying to sidestep every problem with architecture that he's encountered, every big one that he's encountered in his professional career. He used to work for Lufthansa. So he understands what to avoid, and then just build up the elements of the architecture that are necessary to sharing and connection, and try to get everything out of the way. And they're simple connections. And the problem there is that you don't have a lot of initial visibility. People are sharing, but there's not enough articulated meaning visible to be able to connect with other people. But he thinks that eventually you'll get to that point. I don't know if I'm making sense or not.
Yeah.
I get it.
You want me to? Well,
Go ahead.
My thought is that it depends upon, the voting is, you can think of the marketplace as being a voting mechanism, just like a political election is voting. Every time I buy something and don't buy something else, I'm voting. So it's a continuous voting mechanism. It's a very collective. Now, in the situation that I talked about, with that network thing, without any standards, people voted because they wanted to share information with each other, and other people wanted this functionality, so they tended to use it. So that, just like in a market, they voted, and certain things got shared because you need to collaborate with somebody else. So they collectively made that decision. if indeed you're talking about a knowledge system, I might speculate that the success of it and the amount of information you need to make it useful will be on if you can anticipate the population is going to use it. What do they need to share? What do they need to communicate? What will inherently need to be standardized so that they grow out of standardization? And can you create exemplars where the person providing the data gets incentives, gets an attaboy for making more information available? You know, one of the things that'd be nice in all data I've done, and I can't get it in the government, and it's a real frustration, is that almost all the data in the statistical agencies that you hear about in the newspaper is a transformation. It's not raw data.
Yeah.
And most of the time that they publish the data, they never publish where it came from, the actual questions. So you can't say, let's look at poverty. Let's look at poverty for women versus men, whatever it is. And you can't reconstruct that and say, I'd like that same question for just a different subpopulation, because they don't publish it. What's displaced workers? When you look at the stock market reacting to and the Federal Reserve Act. So we don't have that. That's stuff that I would die for. We've tried to get it forever, but it was never, the people producing the data never saw it in their interest to publish it. I guess they never communicated. They never got any trade going. I don't know what, but connecting the data the first time seems to be the first step. The second step is having exemplars of value that people want, so that they start creating that. So the people who are sharing get more visibility, attaboys or whatever, than the people who are not sharing. And maybe create some mechanism that said, well, it's easier to look at my data if you share your data. Is it become a transaction, a trade? I don't know. Philippe, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. So, I move on. I dropped that thought. I don't know exactly what it was, but I'm coming back to these, backstepping a little bit from Alan. So, and back to the point of, it's different between internal to an organization and cross-organizational, because the incentive systems would be very different for the data democratization. I think that is an important part in the conversations around data conversation. What is the organizing the conversational space in which the data democratization is the conversation, where the conversation happens? Because I think it was an important point, Andrew. I think I'd like to bring and float that again, that depending on where it is, you will have different outcomes, and it will be incentivized differently. So I don't know exactly where I'm going with that, but I think it's an important distinction to be made in general, that we understand what we have, and that incentivization is super important to get it right. And I think that was you as well, Kevin, that said in the beginning there, that if we don't have the incentives, we will have the asymmetry, and with that asymmetry, we will never get any good data in the end. So yeah, lots of thoughts around that.
Yeah, I mean, incentives are a big part of collaboration, and seems like, how do you say this? One of the things I hear a lot when people use biology to map back to organizations, and I always that always appeals to me. But one of the things that bugs me is when I hear people talk about creating ecosystems, and what they really mean, they're not setting an environment for those to collaborate themselves, much like Kevin talked about. It's almost like they're putting forth methodologies or some structure that kills the momentum, and that's where it falls apart, I think. So ecosystems are important, but you have to be very careful as to how much of intervention that you put in there. You almost have to be an invisible hand, really, to make sure that you're not um, ruining the development of the ecosystem. You have to understand what the incentives are, and then kind of back off a little bit, not get too involved in organizations. That can be tough. Mainly in my mind because of egos. It's really tough to extricate egos out of the organization, and that's really the cancer sometimes in organization. They can't see the difference between themselves and the outcome of an organization. When I see they, I mean all of us. That's the tough part. I don't know how to solve that one.
It summarized it. I beautifully put, because I had the same observation, but I couldn't articulate in that way. So
I don't know if I articulated very well. This is just kind of
yeah, you did. So I summarize it here in text: the ecosystem to be built by the builders, for the builders, in producing the outcomes in a brief space. And because there's too much ego, I completely agree. The ivory tower architects that set the rules for every system, there in their ivory towers hoping for the best, but not in the hockey game actually moving the puck forward. They're playing to where the puck isn't. And so that's crazy, because then it's impossible to know in the future. So you need to build for where you are at the moment, but then you need to be a builder. So there's a very strong tension between the two, of creating the necessary scaffolding for that to happen, but also to let go and let the builders have their way.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Really like that.
Yeah, this thought popped up in my head back when I was in college. I was a big college basketball fan, and I remember this one coach. He was in our conference, Jerry Tarkanian. He coaches UNLV. And one of the things I noticed about him versus all the other coaches, and I thought he must be the best coach in existence. When he was at the game, he would sit there, no response. He wasn't animated, but his players played. He just watched them, maybe casually directed it. He did all his work up front, setting them up. But when the game started, hands off. And they just did their work. They they obliterated most of their opponents, including Duke. Anyway, the reason why I bring that up is because it seemed to me like he set everything up ahead of time, allowing them to be their best selves. And then when game time happened, it was hands off. He was just, I'm just going to watch. And I've rarely seen that, even among better coaches. What is that?
Yeah, I think Mike Leach was kind of similar in college football.
Texas Tech, yeah.
Yeah, my son goes to Washington State, and Mike Leach was behind the air raid offense, and it was just an entirely different approach to offense that he had implemented. And once you had that in place, it was just a much more dynamic game that resulted from it. So I think that, going back to what Kevin was talking about with the statistics, that's something that's just annoyed and frustrated me, how so few people are documenting up front where they're getting the information, why it's valuable in that sense. Andrew, if we could just build up front the mechanism for establishing the confidence in the data to begin with, because if somebody just sends me a table, I'm just going to doubt what's in there or my interpretation of it to begin with. And so how can you share on that basis?
And that's largely what we have,
Yeah.
Answer, and oddly enough, people don't work that way. We like to see lineage. We like to see where it come from. We like intuitively, we exercise first principles, right? We want to know, how did that happen? And how did that happen? How did that happen? That's what gives us confidence. That's how trust works.
Exactly. And some of these people sending me the tables, they were sitting right next to me, but I couldn't trust their work.
Yeah. So any kind of data network, its core capability is just lineage, even if it's wrong.
Right.
Even who cares if it's wrong? You know, as the math teacher says, show your work.
Show your work.
Show our work. Largely, and whatever technological mechanism we have to change the way things are, we have to inherently always keep lineage.
It's also, that kind of provenance. If you want to link data together, which increases the power of the data, you have to know something about, the time the data represents, the time it was collected, what geography, what state of geography you're dealing with, what are the concepts, are they the similar concepts? And what's the universe of people that are represented? So you can't, people are linking data all the time and they're really don't have anything to do with each other. And people, the thing that Andrew's talking about is how much money are you willing to bet? And Alan's talking about how much money are you willing to bet on that data to make a decision?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's the core idea as a technologist that I hear more or less is basically the combination of open data, open source transformations, and open source software around it as well, so that you can see end to end what is happening, and that you have the logic more or less formalized around the transformations along the axis of the raw data. You need to have access to that in terms of open data, but then be able to follow the entire trail until you can see what you have in front of you. Show the work, like when you're writing a paper, you cite your sources, you write the logic, you come to a conclusion, people can follow it and they can replicate.
That is the knowledge quantum that I've articulated, that Alan has articulated, that you have articulated, that we don't have.
Yeah.
We don't have data, metadata, knowledge, logic as a single deliverable unit, as a basis for such a knowledge network. Even in knowledge graphs, that's just metadata and data. We don't have them all together. We don't deliver in that way. That's the quantum that Zhamak Dehghani talks about in data mesh, and probably the best part of all her ideas. Not to knock down everything else, but to me, that's the one I walk away with. That simple concept. We don't, we haven't put those together.
There are some interesting parts here in that we're bringing together over these calls. There is a number of calls that kind of draw lines between these things. It's very interesting to see this emerge.
Yeah, I don't see us getting there. It's without having that building block. Because take any problem, take a use case, like let's say Kevin talks about something that failed and why it failed. I'm not saying it answers all the questions, but if you don't have a knowledge building block that is like that you can take anywhere, you take it out of the equation of the context it was created and put it somewhere else and link to something else that is created in the same way. I don't know how far you can get that way. It's like having partial memories, right? And trying to articulate them to someone else.
Yeah, and I think that I'm thinking about the communities that sort of have been struggling with this. I do some genealogy work in my spare time, and I like these single trees that have been established, and some of them are open source. WikiTree is an open source one. Findagrave.com is another one, and Family Search is the Mormon one that's huge, that's up there, and they all have their problems, because not everybody's consistent in how they post their data, but they all try to impose these standards And so at Wikitree, for example, you have to cite your source if you're going to put something in there. And maybe it can just be, you heard this from a family member, but you do have to cite your source. I mean, that's like a starting point, but it doesn't really get you to where you're confident that the building blocks you're talking about, Andrew, that are being added are going to be correct. Because in genealogy work, you have to establish every connection, and it's like there's a 1 to 5 ranking for how solid that connection is, and the further back in time you get, it becomes guesswork. It just becomes guesswork because you don't have the data to be able to establish that this person was related to that one. So where do you stop?
Yeah, that's true. Before you take off, Philippe, I think that what you're talking about, Alan, I think Kevin was mentioning in the group that was successful in achieving de facto standards, they had understanding. They achieved understanding amongst themselves, and that understanding is the true knowledge that are and it also doubles as the consensus. And when we get, answers like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the whatever galaxy, wherever that book was, the meaning of life is 42. That's what all our data looks like. The hell is 42, right? What do you say?
Because they need to be there.
That's the kind of insight and knowledge we get today. The meaning of life is like some number.
Yeah.
Meaning is the provenance or the lineage, because even if you have the same terminology, you have polysemes. I mean, two terms that you think could mean the same thing, but then people have different interpretations and they diverge, thinking they know the same thing, but they don't. The unknown knowns, or whatever they call it.
Part of it.
Thank you so much for taking time.
Go ahead.
Yeah, see it.
Part of it's like, how do you develop a commerce between different data sources so that people have incentives to do exactly what you're saying, where they have incentives to make the stuff combinational and so you can plug things together. One of the things I found in my experience, which was very frustrating, is the people who produce the data are often not the people who use the data. And the people that use the data, they make all these demands about the way people should do this, that, and the other thing, but they were never willing to fund that. And so as oftentimes the users are kind of naive in their expectations, but how do you build the commerce where people want to share their data, and that by sharing their data, even if they have different definitions of what this medical operation is, or this term is, you can understand the gradations. If you deal with a lot of trade between different parties, that will surface, I would think, but I'm not sure how to get that kind of interaction going.
But that interaction is essential. You mentioned that the users sometimes ask questions that they're naive, but it's naivete that moves things forward. I think I heard someone the other day talk about students, how they teach their students to ask. The beauty of students is that they don't know what's not possible, and when you don't know what's not possible, you just assume that it can happen, and that's what moves disciplines forward. And so those who have been entrenched, like us in IT, when we think about what's possible and not possible, they think of things without those boundaries, and then it causes us to think, oh, maybe we should be doing something in a different way. So making the connection between those two groups, that this cross-disciplinary group is the key to moving anything forward, it seems, because you break these boundaries you set for yourself in a given discipline, because you got people with naivety asking questions.
I've got to pop off.
Yep.
I apologize.
Yeah, no problem. I think we should probably call it a day.
Very thoughtful. Thank you.
Yep. Hey guys, thanks for regrouping, and I will make a point to make sure these are a little more regular through the end of the year. And have a good one.
Yeah, thanks for putting it together.
Bye.
See ya.